This lecture will talk about families and our communities. We're going to talk about an overall framework for understanding what families are experiencing, as well as some of the benefits of working with families and how we get started on the right foot. So let's start by asking the question, why is the environment so important? Well, some of our best examples of what can happen with environment are the tragic examples that tell us what happens when we don't get enough environmental supports. So I have 3 examples for you on this page, and the first one is the wild boy of Avignon, and at age 12 this child was found in the forest in France in 1797, and no one really knows exactly how he got there or what happened, but in some way he was abandoned or lost, or in some way he was fending for himself, living as literally a wild child in the forest. And when they found him at the age of 12, of course he didn't really have language. He was raised by a teacher of deaf, mute children, so she tried to work with him to formulate verbal and social skills and help him to develop, but he had been living, literally, he was a feral child, a wild child, and he never learned proper verbal or social skills. And so this would be evidence that if you miss the window, if it's too late, sometimes it's too late. You literally miss this window of opportunity to teach a human being the things that they need to know to function appropriately. Jeannie is a more recent example, very famous, and this is a little girl who was locked in a room and tied to a potty chair, completely restrained for 13 years. There were times that she wasn't tied to the potty chair and that she was in like a dog kennel. She was kept mainly in the dark, and she was abused for making any noise. And when they found her, she was, of course, physically deformed, underdeveloped, very little verbal or social skills. She wasn't toilet trained. She didn't know how to eat. Eventually, she did learn about 100 words, but she was never able to learn, the full vocabulary, range of vocabulary that a person would develop had they not been treated this way. And Jeannie this was very famous. She was discovered in the 70s, and researchers and doctors and experts from all over the world, people wanted to help Jeannie because it's such a terrible tale to think that someone was treated like an animal. And even with all of the best experts, what we found is that, really when you miss out on an opportunity for the things that you need early on, the stimulation that you need, the love that you need, the care that you need, so the cognitive stimulation, the social emotional stimulation, and of course the physical stimulation and health and care, that you can't properly grow and develop, and that even helping later on can't make up for all of the losses early on. And then, of course, institutionalized children, and Ceausescu's Romania has given us a recent example of children who've been abandoned in orphanages, and if you've seen some of the footage, you see like one caretaker in a room of 100 babies with multiple babies in a crib, and even bottles kind of tied to the side so you could eat, but the children almost have to kind of crawl over and use what's propped up, and they didn't, these children they weren't held and cooed at and talked to and told, oh, I love you, and given lots of toys because there were very few caretakers and far too many children. And the scariest examples, I think, are when you see the footage of a whole room full of babies and nobody's crying, because these children have learned that there's no point. There's no point in crying because nobody's going to come and care for me. And what we know about these children that start off with such difficulties is that depending on how long it lasted and how severe it was in terms of their neglect, sometimes it's quite difficult to really recuperate from that, and you see language delays, and you see social emotional difficulties, and you see physical stunting and difficulties in physical growth and development over time. So these are all case studies that tell us that what happens in the early years is really crucial. It's really important, and in fact, if you mess it up, some of it can't really even be necessarily regained. We can always improve the situation. Certainly you see that Jeannie was better off after she had help than before she had help, but we do see that what happens in the early years is also so critical, because if we believe that that a child is born with capabilities for all sorts of things, and then we deprive them of the opportunity for that, it's really it's tragic. So these are dramatic examples, but anyway, the takeaway message I think is very clear. The environment is very important. What we do is very important. Okay, so environment has direct influences and indirect influences. So direct influences are very clear, and as I said in the previous slide, those are the most dramatic examples. But deprivation of food, of course, affects physical growth. Children who are physically neglected, they're underfed in the early years, tend to be smaller. Their bodies do not grow as quickly, particularly if it goes on for a very long period of time. And there's a direct influence socially in terms of what the child learns and observes. So culture, for example, teaches, these are direct influences. So whether you learn to bow or kiss a person once on each cheek, those are sort of cultural influences, things we observe. And they're peer influences and social skills. So environment has absolutely a direct influence. It tells us kind of what to do. It gives us our social cues. And then there are indirect influences on children via kind of other things that are occurring. So for example, divorce can strain a parent's ability to care for the child because they're very stressed out and maybe not as able to read a story for the 100th time on a particular given night. So you have indirect influences on children as well as the direct influences. So we're going to take a look at a theoretical framework that's going to lay this out for us. The ecological model of context is Bronfenbrenner's model. It's also called the human ecological model or the human ecological theory or just ecological model. These are interchangeable terms. This is a very popular family theory used to study child development, and it was developed by Yuri Bronfenbrenner in the 1970s. And the basic premise is that each layer of the environment interacts with and influences all of the other environments inside of it. So if you think of dropping a pebble in a pond, it ripples out. But then you'd also have to, when you look at this model, think that that it ripples back in too. Okay, so it's the idea that everything is coming in toward the center, but it's also leaving the center and going out. And you can see that represented in the arrows, that they're bidirectional. So they're coming into the middle, and then they're also leaving on the way out too. There are 4 levels: the macrosystem, the exosystem, the mesosystem, and the microsystem. And we're going to look at these in more detail. Okay, so the first layer is the child. And the child is at the very inside in that microsystem. It's the individual level. And at the individual level, or the child level, we have our biological makeup. So whatever is your evolutionary heritage and your genetic inheritance and the interaction between your genes and environment, these are individual characteristics. So for example, some children might be born with a propensity or likelihood for diabetes. And then if those children in their environment become overweight, then they are far more likely to develop diabetes than, let's say, another child who may be eating all of the same stuff and may even be overweight but doesn't have that same genetic disposition. So we see kind of this interplay already of an interaction between genes and environment. But you have individual characteristics that we're born with. And we have innate qualities too. We generally achieve predictable developmental milestones. So we tend to roll over around the same time. We start walking around the same time. We start talking around the same time within a range, but still we go through a series of predictable developmental milestones. We're active learners. We're not passive learners. We like to learn about our world, and so we go forth and we put things in our mouths so that we can discover that they're wonderful, and oh, isn't that magnificent, that thumb, that side of my hand that I can play with, and oh, isn't that fantastic, this thing that I can grab and bang against the floor. Children are active learners. We're born that way. And we are social beings. We are seeking out social interaction all of the time. Much of what young children do is designed to bring us in proximity with other human beings. So we cry because we're social, and not only do we want to be fed, but we want to be held, we want to be looked at, we want to be smiled at. That's why we smile at others. Some of the examples that I gave you before in those case studies looked at what happens when we are deprived of that, and it's unnatural. It's against our innate qualities to think of walking into a room with a bunch of silent babies, because we are social and we are kind of wired for that human interaction. So in that first little ring, we've got the child. And the microsystem these are the environments that directly affect a child's development, their immediate surroundings. So this includes the family and the home, the child care early learning setting, school, neighborhood, friends, job. Now neighborhood's kind of a tricky one because you can see that it's in the next ring too, but it's kind of whoever is like right in that child's immediate surroundings. Okay, so the people that are just kind of right there, they directly impact the child. They talk to the child, they see the child, they interact with that child. And then the mesosystem is kind of an exchange of information between the microsystem environments. So you have, let's say, parent-teacher conferences and slumber parties with friends from school, or parents helping children with homework, or those kinds of things. Internship for school, for example, like with a much, much older child. That's the mesosystem. It's what's right outside the microsystem, and it's closer in, but it's not the same kind of direct impact that you saw in that previous slide. And then the exosystem are the environments and social settings that do not include the child, but they do indirectly affect development. So the parent's workplace has an impact on the child. If that parent is an accountant, then boy, that month of March and the first 2 weeks of April up to April 15th, that parent is stressed out because that parent works on taxes, and that has an indirect effect then on the child because the parent then is a little stressed out, or maybe is working longer hours. So that's an example of an exosystem impact. The parent's social support. Do the parents have friends and people they can call, people they can ask for help if they need things? The socioeconomic status of the family is part of the exosystem. The health and welfare services in the community. When I did my dissertation research, I worked with a community that was very rural, and you could go 45 minutes to drive from one office to another to access any kind of services. The school PTA and mass media, those would be examples of things that we would find in our exosystem. In the macro system, we have our cultural values, laws, customs, resources. So anything around our culture, our systems of beliefs, attitudes, values, guidelines for our behavior. There are a lot of cultural differences in socialization of children. As I mentioned before, this is one of the reasons that we really look at our own background in this class, and that we really look also at other people's cultural backgrounds too, because there are just differences in how we raise children. And cultures have subcultures too, in terms of ethnicity, religion, occupation. So you can look, let's say, at a very broad culture and say Latino culture, but there are really substantial subcultures within Latin American groups, for example. So, as I said, there are subcultures as well. But all of those things are in the macro system. And then there's the chronosystem. And the chronosystem looks at time. Chrono means time, and it just encompasses the dimension of time as it relates to a child's environment. So as children get older, they might react differently to environmental changes and might be more able to determine how that change will influence them. An infant has absolutely no ability to regulate themselves when they're frustrated that mom can't come and play with me right now because mom has to do taxes. But an older child might be able to say, well, okay, fine, but next week will you take me? So there's always an aspect of time, and some of it has to do with the child's development, and other things have to do with what's going on even in a particular society or community at a particular time, or even in a family at a particular time. So the timing of a parent's death or divorce. So you could have a child that, let's say at school, can really roll with it if their classmate gets on their nerves. But if they're going through the grief of losing a parent, they might not be feeling so patient. They might be really, be really frustrated or react in a totally different way because they're experiencing something at that moment that changes how they perceive what's happening in the systems around them. The start of puberty is also another example of how there are environmental changes and kind of things that happen across time that even if it's the same stuff happening in the system, it might be different for the child because where the child is a different place in time. 9/11 and Hurricane Katrina are also examples of things that can happen, points in time that impact what's happening in the system or how we perceive the system or how the system reacts. So chronosystem changes in family contexts. We know that over time our society has changed in a lot of ways that affect children's development. There are some examples listed for you here. For example, women and mothers entering the workforce. That's definitely something that has impacted what we expect in terms of child development, and it certainly impacted early learning because children have to be somewhere, and where they are is they're with us in early learning settings. The number of divorced parents, number of two-parent heterosexual families, college attendance, media messages targeting children. So these are all kind of examples of things, examples of ways where there's been change. There's been wider change in the macro system. Our cultural norms have changed. Our communities have changed. And some of these really can be attached to time periods that you can look and say, well, some of this expectation in the exosystem started changing here. Or, even simple things like media messages targeting children. I think it's very interesting that over time, Hot Wheels cars, which used to be marketed to boys up through the age of 12, are now considered to only be marketed to children. For a while it was up to the age of 8, and now they're saying, well, it's really only up to the age of 6. So it's very interesting how media messages also change then developmental norms, because if 4th graders see all other 4th graders playing with Hot Wheels, then they too will play with Hot Wheels. But if they see no one else playing with Hot Wheels, then they certainly won't. So we see shifts over time, even in the kinds of things that children do. So that's an example of how something that takes place in the macro system, this message about, let's say, Hot Wheels, then trickles down into communities and into schools and into families, and eventually, you have an individual child who at the age of 9 says, well, I'm too old for that. So we definitely see that there are things related to time that impact our family, our changes, and that those are things that impact our family contexts. Here's kind of a picture of it for you. You can see the child in the middle and the microsystem. They're sitting in the microsystem. That's that's where they're sitting. And then you've got the mesosystem and the microsystem kind of interacting. And the exosystem is that gray area, and then the macrosystem is all around them. So you can see these influences on the child, but also the child influences all of those other things. I mentioned to you that it's a ripple going, kind of going in, but it's also a ripple going out, because if you have, let's say, a child who does not sleep at night, that can impact the parent, that impacts the job. If you have a lot of children who are not sleeping at night in a particular community, because let's say Hurricane Katrina has taken place and the children are traumatized, and so a lot of children are not sleeping and a lot of children are very stressed out. Maybe you could even have a whole school system responding very differently to what are we going to do and how are we going to support children, because this is what children are experiencing, and they're tired and they're stressed and they're not sleeping, and parents are tired and they're stressed and they're not sleeping, and we've got all of these needs, and so then we see things kind of rippling out too based on what families, individual families, are experiencing. Some of you who work with military families might experience this too, that if you work, let's say, on post or on base, and a whole unit deploys, and a lot of the children in your center have parents in that unit, you can feel it. You can feel the ripple. You can feel how children are impacted and how their parents are impacted, and how the workplace around you is impacted, and how the community right there on post is impacted, and in the surrounding area. So there's definitely, it's an influence that goes both ways. Okay, we're going to switch gears now and talk a little bit about the benefits of working with teachers and families. It's important to understand the context so that we're prepared to do that. And now that we've thought about the context, we're going to think about how important it is to work with families and why it's beneficial. Well, it's beneficial for children because when children see that their school, or including early learning settings, that when school and parents are happy together, children feel more secure, and they have decreased anxiety in school environment and improved academic performance. When children see that their parents and their teachers get along, like each other, it's low conflict, when there's a good supportive relationship, children are more secure, they have less anxiety, and higher academic performance. So in an early learning setting, that means they're more able to complete the cognitive tasks that you set out before them. They have a higher sense of self-worth when they perceive that others value and respect their parents. Isn't that something? Children are, they don't always tell you what they're thinking, because children don't have the language, the vocabulary to say, gosh, I feel a little marginalized because I'm not sure that you like my mom. Children can't really process that. They can get a funny feeling in their tummy and think, boy, I don't think that teacher likes my mom or likes my family. But they certainly, are not going to tell you that either. You're an authority figure. They can't really process that, but they can feel it. But the other side of that is that when children see that their parents are liked by their teachers, they have a sense of it gives them a sense of self-worth, because when you're a kid, you know that you belong to your family for life, that your family is your family. And when you can be proud of your family because people like your family, that makes you feel good. It gives you a sense of self-worth. And also, children benefit from having knowledgeable, consistent responses from all adults in their lives. Children do benefit when everybody's on the same page. There are definite benefits for parents too. When parents feel that they have a good relationship with the school, they feel kind of supported in their parenting. As we've talked about before, parenting is such a difficult job, and people question themselves a lot, and most people really think like, oh, I hope I'm doing a good enough job. And when you feel liked by teachers, by schools, as a parent, then you feel like, okay, then I think I'm getting some things right. Okay, this is good. It's definitely helpful for parents to get that kind of positive reassurance and affirmation. Also, parents can benefit by gaining knowledge and skills to support parenting and supporting their children's education. If parents feel that you like them, then they will be more receptive to the suggestion of, hey, when you're in the car, what you could do is when you stop at a red light, ask your child, do they recognize any letters on the street sign? People are open to that if they feel that you like them. But if parents feel that you don't like them, if there isn't a good relationship between the parents and the school, they don't want to hear that, because they'll feel like maybe it's criticism, or maybe you think that they're not a good parent already. And so it's helpful too, because when you have a good relationship, you can impart that in ideas, and parents can give you ideas too, because that door is open. Also, it enhances parental self-esteem. When people are invited to participate and make a contribution to their children's school life, it makes them feel valued. And when you feel valued, it makes you feel good. And when you feel good, it heightens your self-esteem. There are benefits for teachers too. Maybe some of you have heard about the benefits for children or thought about the benefits to parents, but there's also a benefit to you to work hard to develop relationships with all parents because it gives you increased knowledge about individual children, their backgrounds, their needs. Um, it opens the door for more positive feedback when you have a good relationship with the parents. It makes you feel good. Like, okay, maybe the parents think I'm doing a good job. It increases your teacher confidence and social skills and supports efforts. And then you might be more open to parent resources for enriched learning experiences in and out of the classroom. Because maybe you'll have the opportunity to learn something from one of those parents too. Sometimes parents can be very helpful, but generally speaking, people are only helpful when they feel that they're liked. And so it's really important to develop these good relationships. I have an example to share. One of my students that I had once, I just remember I kind of bristled at her behavior with me. I kept thinking, why is she so kind of overly familiar, and I perceived her manner of speech to be really just disrespectful to me, and I just felt like it was really extreme. And then when I got to know the parents, I saw that it wasn't really that the child was being disrespectful, it's just the way that they spoke, the way that they interacted. I think there were some differences in terms of the part of the country that they came from versus where I came from, and maybe some cultural aspects, my own background and, growing up and my expectations. And once I got to know the family, I felt like I understood the child better. And then instead of, kind of bristling at how the parents talked to me or how the child talked to me, I could get past that. And the parents, we really grew to like each other quite a bit. But it took some work, and it definitely, for me, took me to kind of stepping aside and saying, okay, I'm not going to get hung up on this. I'm not going to get hung up on how offended I am. I've just got to try to look past that and see what is the real deal that they're really talking about. And then once we could do that, we really were able to move forward. Okay, so how do we do this? Well, how do we start this off so that it can work well and be a functional relationship for all of us? Well, some of our first contacts make a big difference, makes a big impression how we portray ourselves. So orientation is usually one of the first things that happens. It's the initial contact between the teacher, the parent, and the child. So sometimes that's in the form of an open house or a back to school night, although usually even that's preceded by an open house. Sometimes it's the tour of the school that parents do, and they come into your classroom. Remember that when folks come into your classroom to do a tour, they are not bothering you or interrupting your day. They are potentially bringing new business into your place of work, your place of employment. And if people stop touring, they won't need you anymore. So nobody likes disruption in the day, but do remember that that is a crucial part of your job, is to be welcoming to new parents and for you to communicate in that first moment. Yes, I'm delighted to meet you. I'm delighted to see you. I'm delighted by your presence because I would be delighted to work with your child someday. Now, you don't have to drop, what you're teaching or anything, but you do have to be nice and warm and welcoming and not, stiffen up in your body language to communicate that you just wish you didn't have people in your face right now, because after all, can't they see you're doing puppets with the kids? You have to be warm and welcoming when folks are walking through and doing tours. Sometimes these tours or walks through or parents' first contact with the school might be a meeting without children. Maybe they come by after hours or when there aren't kids or when you're on your way out the door, and your director grabs you and says, hey, this is, Miss So-and-so. She teaches the threes room. Do you have a couple minutes to talk to them? And if you do, then you'll sit down and talk with the parents, and sometimes that first meeting is without children. Often, though, in early learning settings, the children are in tow. After all, they're looking for someone for their children to be, so they're often with those parents. It's helpful to think about what kinds of questions you would want to ask the parents. Like, oh, tell me something about your child. Do they have a favorite color? Even just very simple things will make people feel connected. And you want to discuss separation. Separation is really hard. It never really happens that parents are totally comfortable with their child being unhappy that they left. Parents don't drop kids off at the door and the kid cries and the parent says, oh, I don't care. It's just a very upsetting experience for parents that, it's always going to be the child cries and the parent's like, oh no, am I doing the wrong thing? And all of those parental feelings that we talked about in Module A come flooding in, the guilt, the frustration, the anxiety, all of that. So you want to be very clear when you talk with parents at the very beginning about what the separation techniques are, and really reassure the parents, well, a lot of times, especially at the beginning, children will cry a little bit for a couple of minutes, but then they're okay, and here's what we can do about that, and here's our routine that will help you through that. You talk through whatever the procedures are. Is the procedure that the parent can stay with the child for half a day that first time? Is the procedure that they stay 15 minutes? Is the, whatever it is, you should definitely talk it through so that there aren't a lot of surprises. Then, other things to consider in terms of the orientation for the first encounter. You want to talk about how you're going to do it. Are there going to be home visits? Some programs, such as Head Start or Early Head Start, often use home visits. Many for-profit child care centers do not. But in any case, you want to talk about that. You want to talk about letters and phone calls. Are you, going to call the parent to reassure them? Can they call you? Are there, cameras that they can log in and see their child at work? How does it work? Will there be letters home that first week of preschool? Like whatever the deal is, you want to make sure that you lay that out. First visits to a classroom, again, make sure that you're warm and welcoming. Sometimes the first visit happens on the tour and it's right that first second that you meet the parent, but oftentimes, it might not necessarily be. And oftentimes there's a kind of a first visit to a classroom where the child will come on that very first day that they're enrolled and the parent will stay with them some length of time. A few minutes, half an hour, something. And during that time, again, you want to reassure the parent that that's fine, reassure the child that that's fine, because when you reassure the parent, you are also reassuring the child, because it makes the parent relax, which makes the child relax. Children pick up everything from their parents, even when they don't know why, and they pick it up from you and your body language as a teacher too. So oftentimes children's entry into a classroom has an abbreviated schedule. Like, sure, bring your child every day this week for half a day. Or some kind of transition and easing in. Or half a day for the first day and then 2/3 of a day for the second. Things like that. There's often a transition and easing in period. When you're dealing with separation experiences, it's not uncommon to see regressive and aggressive behaviors in young children, particularly our little pumpkins that aren't talking much yet. Sadness is normal. Sometimes you see sadness at the end of the day too. So young children, infants, older infants, toddlers may burst into tears at the end of the day, and sometimes the parent will, it's upsetting. Well, I came to pick up my child. I miss them so much. I thought they'd be so happy to see me. My baby burst into tears. And that just means that the child kind of was holding it in. And when they see the parent, it's relief. It's, oh, I missed you so much, but you weren't here. I couldn't tell you, so I'm crying now. And that's really hard. You're going to have to definitely walk parents through that and reassure them, no, they're not crying because they're unhappy to see you. They're crying because they're actually happy to see you, and they were kind of keeping that in. Transition is something that's difficult for people. Even adults do not like change that much and can experience some anxiety. So both children and parents usually need some reassurance. You want to prepare parents for those separation behaviors. Some parents may also have a hard time because they drop the child off and the child's like, sweet, there's the Lego table, and off they go, and the parent's like, bye, I love you, I'm going to miss you, I love you to the moon and back, and the child is, let me at the water table. And that can be hard too. You have to reassure those parents too. Oh, your child is excited to be here. Your child misses you during the day. I'm so glad we have a picture of your family in the cubby so that your child can see it to reassure themselves during the day. They're just very excited to start their morning. You want to prepare parents for these behaviors. And then welcoming parents into the classroom. Helping parents identify parting rituals will be great. If you don't help parents identify parting rituals, they might stay in your classroom. And maybe that's okay with you, and maybe it's not. But if you haven't communicated about it, then it's probably going to be frustrating. And teachers start to feel like, am I being watched? Maybe the parent is staying because they don't really trust that I'm going to watch little Johnny. They should just leave. Don't they know Johnny's fine? After 15 minutes, Johnny's okay. And you know, it kind of gets into this sort of cycle where people are kind of looking at each other from across the room. So you want to be clear about what your parting rituals are and how that's going to work. Are you going to help your child hang your backpack, give your child a hug and a kiss, walk your child to the first center, say goodbye, I love you, I'll be back at 5 o'clock, and help really help families to develop a strategy for that. Helpful parent behaviors, of course, are, again, being very clear about that. It's not helpful when parents sneak out. That really erodes trust between a young child and their caregiver because it's a sneaky thing to do. Now, it's true that sometimes a child won't cry if the parent sneaks out, but it's also true that the child will notice at some point, oh, my parent can leave at any time. It's much better to just encourage parents to get into the habit of just saying, I love you, I will see you later, I will be back to see you, have a wonderful day. That's a helpful parent behavior. Crying or, kind of telling the child, I don't want to leave either. That's not a helpful parent behavior. But again, if parents are doing this, it means that they haven't done it before. And you may have walked a million children through parting rituals in the morning, but that parent just only has a couple of kids. And probably this is their first child. If they're struggling, then they've probably never done it before. And they need to be walked through it because they don't know. They haven't experienced this 100 times like you have. So again, you want to help develop children's trust in parents. You want to talk about what the separation experience is like. Sometimes it's helpful to have transitional objects like a special blanket or a special lovey object or something like that. And you can have it be transitional. It depends. It really depends on the age of the children, the routine of your classroom, the family, the child, and how you want to do that. But just make sure that you communicate very carefully about that. And finally, just remember that communication is key. Whatever you do, make sure that you communicate it very clearly to the parents. People want the best for their kids, and people want to get along with the school, with the teacher, and when there's a concern, when somebody's frustrated or they kind of come in with sort of unexpected vibe that you think, where's that coming from? It's not about you. It's about the fact that they are stressed, that they're leaving their child, they're worried that it won't go well, and you can really do a lot to comfort parents and reassure parents by just really remaining open to what folks are saying, not reacting to negative stuff, and just kind of meeting people where they're at, saying, I know this is hard. Here are some things that we can do. It communicates respect to the parents when you're open and when you're very clear about what the routines are going to be. So communication is key in terms of building relationships with families.